Well, good morning. Welcome to Debbie's Back Porch. You know, I'm craving a donut, but I don't eat sugar, and I haven't actually had a donut in 10 years. So today I'm going to do an experiment. Can you make donuts with Splenda? And can you make nice yeast-raised glazed donuts with Splenda? Let's go over the ingredients, and I'll answer that question. This is a half cup warm milk, about 110 degrees. I just heated it in the microwave. It took about 20 seconds. And then I have a quarter teaspoonful of salt, not much, just a little. Then I have yeast. This is instant yeast. You can use active dry, but we'll talk more about that. This is a large egg beaten. I have here 3 tablespoons full of unsalted butter, cubed up, and this is 3 tablespoons full of Splenda. This recipe works with sugar. The recipe calls for sugar. I'm experimenting with Splenda. So I'm starting here with 2 1/4 cups of all-purpose flour. May take up to 2 1/2. We'll add if we need to. And I'm adding the yeast. Now you'll notice I'm not proofing the yeast. And the recipe calls for active dry, but generally when you have a recipe where you don't proof the yeast, you use instant. I'm adding here the cubed up butter. Note to self, cube the butter before you bring it to room temperature. And you want to have it to room temperature for this recipe. It was just really hard to cube room temperature butter. So I'm now going to mix this in, and I'm just going to use my hand like you would for a pie crust. You can use a pastry cutter. You can do this in your mixer, but it's so easy to do by hand, so I'm just going to show you that. And you just want to cream the butter until you don't have any big lumps. With a pie crust, we'd want it to be cold, but this is not a pie crust. Now I'm adding in the Splenda or the sugar, whichever you prefer, and just going to mix that around really, really well until there are no big lumps of butter. And last, I'm going to add the salt, and this is just a touch of salt. I wasn't sure about this because, you know, you don't really want to add salt directly to yeast, but this was the recipe, so we're going to try it. So when I get all those ingredients mixed together, I'm going to make a well and add the milk. So I'll just pour this all directly in, and then I'm going to add the egg. And I'll mix this until I have a loose, sticky batter, and it really mixes really easily. And after that, I'm going to go to the KitchenAid mixer for the kneading, but this really only takes about 2 minutes kneading, so you could do it by hand. I used the lower measure on flour. You may have to add a little bit more if your batter is too loose and tacky, but this is not. I used the 2 1/4 cups, and I'm just trying to make sure I get all of that flour incorporated in before I put it into the mixer. Now if you want to do this part in your mixer, you can. You just want to use the paddle attachment, and then you'll switch over to the dough hook later. Now, I'm not trying to get it all thoroughly mixed right now. I just want to get it to all stick together so that the dough hook can pick it up and start the kneading process. And I think we're there now. So I'll start this dough hook, start it on the dough hook, and when it gets all together and smooth, I'll start timing the knead. And with this batter, you do not want to over knead. We're only going to do it about 2 minutes on the low speed. We'll start timing as soon as it's all together, and set your timer for 2 minutes. We can't do the window pane test. We'll just have to depend on the timer. And here we go. So now we want to take this out and put it in the bowl for its first rise. And now this rising is going to happen much more slowly than if you were making, say, bread. Different process. The yeast works more slowly when you add it directly in with the dry ingredients. There we go. And I have here a proofing bowl. You can use any bowl, just as long as it's big enough that your dough won't rise out of it. And this, as I said, rises very slowly. So you can either turn it out onto your counter and work it, or you can just make it into a ball. I usually just take it out and make it into a ball if it's a dough that's firm enough. And this is pretty firm. It feels pretty much like bread. Now I've oiled my bowl so that it won't stick. And I'm going to put it on its top side and then flip it over just so that there's oil all over it so it doesn't form a crust. And I've oiled the underside of my lid, even though this is not going to rise that much. And we will set it aside and let it rise until it's double in size, which could take an hour to an hour and a half. This is a really slow rise. It was an hour and a half, and it's doubled in size, and it's big and puffy. This is one reason I suggest you get some instant yeast. You don't want to wait this long and find out that your yeast was not fresh and not working. If you use active dry, make sure it's within date and that it's fresh. So I'm going to gently poke this down, let some of the air out, and then turn it out onto my pastry sheet here and get it ready to cut. Now I have 2 pans ready. Back here you can see I have a cookie sheet with a piece of parchment on it and some flour. And this dough works really easily. It's very tender. And I don't want to work too much flour into it. I just want to get it so that I can handle it. And I'm going to move the flour out of the way. That's plenty of flour there. I'm going to make these into donuts, the whole roll of dough into donuts, but I'm going to refrigerate part of them. I'm going to cook some of them first, and then I want some fresh ones after dinner. So when I cut these, I'm going to move them into 2 separate pans. In one pan, I'll refrigerate. So that's good for you to know if you want to have fresh donuts when you're having guests. You want them good and hot, because these really are better hot, just like the donuts you buy. So I'm going to roll this out to about a 1/2 inch, and this doesn't take a lot of pressure because it's really very tender. And once I get it rolled out, I'm going to let it rest for just a minute, and it will kind of contract. So I'm going a little thin right now, but it'll pull back in together and contract and be about a 1/2 inch. And I've got a little donut cutter here. It's a 2.5 inch donut cutter. You can use 2 different size cookie cutters. You don't have to have a donut cutter. And after I did this, by the way, I realized this is too little. I don't like them this size. I should have gotten a 3 inch. But I'm going to cut them out, and some of them stay and some of them come up with the cutter, and I had to very carefully remove some of them. And again, I wish I'd just used 2 different cookie cutters, because it was kind of hard to get the little holes out. But we'll cut these out and put them on our tray, and you'll see I had to get a knife to get some of the holes out. But it wasn't hard. I just was trying to be very careful not to tear the donut. Now you can either save these holes and cook them separately, little donut holes, or you can put it all back into the dough, roll it again, and cut until you're down to the very end. There's just a little bit of flour on there to keep them from sticking. And I ended up re-rolling, combining and re-rolling twice. And I learned something in that process that I'll use next time. The last ones I did, the ones that had been kneaded the most, actually browned up more nicely than the first ones I cut. So I'm thinking maybe I should have rolled it and hand kneaded it just a little bit more. I'll show you what I mean when I actually start frying these up. One of the things about baking with Splenda or sucralose sweetener is that things don't brown the same as they do with sugar. So I'm cleaning my little cookie cutter off here. It's kind of building up on it and making them stick more. So you see that I've rolled this out again, and I'm getting a second cutting, and then I'll get a third cutting. Let me tell you about the delayed rise, the refrigerated donuts. The ones I'm going to cook now will have to rise about 30-40 minutes. You can't really tell that they double in size, but they get puffier. The ones I want to cook after dinner, I will set out 2 hours before dinner and let them come to room temperature and rise. And I didn't video cooking those, but I have to tell you the slow rise really improved the texture. I think the next time I make donuts, I'm going to plan on the slow rise, couple hours in the refrigerator and then a couple hours out on the counter rising. So we're going to cover these with the oiled plastic wrap. The oil, of course, is to keep it from sticking, because if you don't do that when you pull your plastic wrap off, it'll catch and pull the air out. And then these are the ones that I'm going to cook right away, well, after they rise for about an hour. I'll be back and show you that. While they're rising, I'm going to show you how to make a Splenda glaze. And this can be used on donuts, but it can also be used on your bundt cakes, wherever you want a glaze or something like a sweet icing. Something you would normally make with confectioner's sugar. So I've put 1.5 cups of Splenda in my food processor. I've added 1/4 cup of cornstarch, and we're going to blend that up, just pulse it a few times, until it has the consistency of confectioner's sugar. We want it to be very, very fine, and that happens quickly in a food processor. You could use a blender if a blender is what you use. So this doesn't take long, and when you get it done, you want to pour it up into a bowl. Let me unplug that. And I have 1/4 cup water measured out. That's going to be up to you. You may want a very thin glaze. You may want something thicker. You get to control that. I want it fairly thin with my donuts, but if you're doing this to go on a pound cake or something like that, you may want to make it thicker so that it kind of stands up and stays on the top. So I have 1/4 cup of room temperature water, and I'm going to add about half of it and stir it up and see what we have. Now, this tends to fly, so you want to stir it pretty carefully. And gauge as you go along. When you get it to the thickness you want, stop adding the water. 1/4 cup is just a starting place. You may even add up to 1/3 cup. You don't want it to be too thin. But what we're going to do is dip our donuts in this and then let them sit. And so I want it to be a consistency that's not too thick. See, there you go. And just stir until you get any lumps out. It won't make many lumps, but the cornstarch might, So that was easy peasy. Now I'm going to set it to the side and we'll fry our donuts. If you have a deep fryer, you may want to use a deep fryer. I'm going to use my cast iron skillet here. I have about 1 inch of oil in it. Here are my donuts. You can see how they've puffed up. I have a rack here, and I'm going to stick a paper towel under the rack. That's really a better way to drain things if you want them to stay crispy than to put them directly on a paper towel. This way the towel will catch the oil, but your donut won't be sitting in oil. So we'll test this the way I always test things. I'm going to drop a little piece in and see if I like how it sizzles. If it sizzles right away and comes to the top, your oil is hot. If you're using a deep fryer, or you may want to use a candy thermometer, but you want to set your temperature on 375. So I'm putting these in with a little bamboo stick. You could do it with a fork, but the holes on these are little, so I'm using a bamboo stick. And you want to make sure it's a bamboo stick, because some wood will sizzle when you put it in there. And I'm just going to drop them in, not too close together. I want to give them plenty of room. Now, I've timed this. I'm cooking them a minute on each side. And if you're cooking with sugar, it might not be quite as much. I want to get a little brown on these without overcooking them. And as I mentioned before, things don't brown the same when you're cooking with Splenda as they do when you're cooking with sugar. I think that's pretty obvious why. Because sugar caramelizes and Splenda doesn't. So you're not going to get it as dark brown as you would if you're using it with Splenda. But you can hit them a little bit. They start to sound hollow. And I cooked it a minute on the first side. Then I flipped it. And then I cooked them, maybe 10 more seconds on the first side again. And then I'm going to fry up the little donut holes. And you may have to actually poke a hole in these with your bamboo stick because they'll swell up and float. All done frying. Now we're going to dip them into the glaze. And I'm using my bamboo stick for that too. Once again, you can use a fork. We're just going to dip them in, flip them over, which seemed to be a big job for me to flip it over. But we're going to flip them over. These are pretty good without the glaze. They're not very sweet. I think to get the full donut effect, you need the glaze. And I'm going to dip all of these and then I'll come back. So here we go. This has been about a minute. They're cooled off and they look like donuts. And remember I told you the ones that I worked more, they're kind of rough looking because these were the last two, but you see, fried the same amount of time, they're darker. So next time, I'll just work my dough a little more. These look pretty darn good to me, especially the last two. I have a guinea pig to try these on. Meat specialist Elijah Seagrave's home on leave for 2 weeks with Grandma. So he's my guinea pig. Go ahead, you can bite it. Okay? Yeah.
Oh my.
Is it good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I gotta have one.
Not at all.
Oh, it's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's good. I need some milk with that.
Okay. Well, he ate 4, and that made it worth it all. Thank you for joining us on Debbie's Back Porch. Hope you try this. Hope you like it. Hope to see you again tomorrow.